Hello, good day. Today on our show is the brilliant Jonathan Otto Poe, and he will be teaching us about the Soviet, Nazi Germany, and European imperialism. Hello, Jonathan. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
I'm great, Jonathan. Colonialism is not unique to black people or non-whites. For centuries, Europeans fought wars and colonized each other. So, in one of your articles, you discuss a very important issue, internal colonialism, and you applied it to the Soviet. Please give us a little information on internal colonialism. What is internal colonialism?
Well, there's two basic strands of internal colonial theory. One is developed by really Robert Blauner, who was a sociologist, I believe, at Cal, and also the Black power advocate Stokely Carmichael, that it applied to minorities that had been deterritorialized, particularly those who were the result of forced migration. So they were primarily looking at the descendants of African slaves in the United States. But the theory had been then applied to ethnic minorities, including indigenous ones that had been displaced from their original territory in a variety of settings, places in Latin America. Uh, and that's more the theory I use in the article you're referring to. Uh,
Colonialism in one country, they
yeah,
deported people in the USSR as an example of internal colonialism.
right, because the deportation deterritorialized them, and in some cases, the territorialization was rather um, uh, tenuous to begin with because there were groups that had come in as colonists, particularly the Germans, but could also look at the Koreans in the Far East. So, in this sense, you have a, a rather unusual uh, case if you compare it to the non-European world that uh, places like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, before that Poland, have this form of colonization where they invite colonists into their own state because there are areas that are underpopulated and they don't have enough people within the state already to settle them, particularly regions on the border, hostile peoples are that are subject to attack, but there are other reasons as well. And so you see the Russian Empire, which is huge, has from the 18th century all the way up until really, one could argue, even into the 1930s, a policy of bringing in foreigners to for economic and strategic reasons.
Okay, thanks. Jonathan, how oppressive was this strategy for those who were victimized?
Oh, the deportations. Well, I mean, they basically, if you look at the period of time from 37 to uh, even after the death of Stalin to 56, they uprooted these people almost in their entirety, forcibly relocated them to very far away, usually Siberia or Kazakhstan or other areas of Central Asia, placed them in areas that had basically very limited material ability to absorb them as far as housing, food, and medical care, and then placed them under very severe restrictions for their movement. That is, that tied them to their new places of forced settlement, which were inadequate as far as material conditions to begin with. So they were quite horrendous, and the death rates were very high, somewhere between 15% and 30%, depending on which group you're talking about, perish within about 4 to 5 years. So that's a very large number of premature deaths from material deprivation.
Yeah. And some of the groups were the Crimean Tatars, the Chechens, the Balkars, Russian Koreans, etc.
Yeah, if we look, the Koreans are the first in 37, and the Germans in 41. Then we have a whole bunch of groups in the period of time between November 43 and 44. So there you have the North Caucasians, the Karachais, Chechens, English, Balkars, Kalmucks, Crimean Tatars, and then the last large group deported in its near entirety were the Meskhetian Turks from the border with Georgia and Turkey.
Yeah, but for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with Soviet history, why are these deportations important, and why were they motivated?
Uh, well, I mean, it is a rather large technical feat altogether. We're talking uh, over 2.5 million people. The Germans alone, deportation in 41 was something like around 800,000 people removed from various areas of the European parts of the USSR to the Asian parts. So in this sense, it's a rather large undertaking. They're taking groups based upon their ancestry, however you want to call that. The Soviets use the term nationalnost. Uh, we might call it ethno-racial, since that's kind of how they defined it. Basically, people descended of groups that spoke a language with the main marker, and placed them in these sparsely populated territories in the eastern regions of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So you have here a significant policy of differential treatment of it's not a huge minority. The Soviet Union has a large population, but nonetheless, we're talking again, as I said, a couple million people.
Interesting. But Jonathan, was race an important construct in the Soviet Union?
Well, it depends what you mean by race again. All right, so these groups are clearly defined by ancestry,
Yes.
and in kind of a Western view, all right, we would consider people that are related by ancestry and kinship, and therefore have certain indelible traits, as it were, that are passed on from generation to generation. That and there's no escape from it, right? So you inherit the race of your ancestors, and you pass it on automatically to your children, unless, of course, there's a mixture with another group, and then in case it gets a little bit more fuzzy. But in the case of most of the world, including the Soviet Union this time, there's an extremely high rate of endogamy. That is, people don't marry outside of their own cultural group. So yeah, it would be. I would say it was in that case, but I'm not sure the term matters that much, as long as we understand that these are people being deported for whom they are, and that they inherited this at birth, and it's unchangeable, and it's passed on to the next generation. So, if you want to use the term nationalnost or ethnos or ethnicity rather than race, I'm not going to waste time arguing at this point, although I have in the past, simply because I don't think it means that much if you just understand what the basic we're talking about indelible ancestral groups.
Yes. Let me read an excerpt from your essay. The success of Soviet policies in assimilating the deported peoples to Soviet Russian linguistic and cultural norms is hard to measure, but the evidence that does exist shows that among many deported nationalities, that Russian replaced their titular language as the primary language used by the group. Did people resist? Was there a strong element of resistance to Russian cultural oppression or cultural imperialism?
Uh, yes, there was resistance, and but in the case of the loss of indigenous language and linguistic acculturation, it was hard to do so once they were dispersed because they were no longer in compact settlement areas. So all of the other people they were coming into contact with, as far as work, as far as education, as far as the people living around them, was a completely different linguistic environment. And while it wasn't always a Russian linguistic environment, Russian was the only language that they had in common with these other people. So uh, there had been growing bilingualism among, for instance, the ethnic Germans who were deported. And then they arrived in Kazakhstan. Uh, they found that a lot of the Kazakhs didn't speak any Russian. So there was a lot of tension and a lot of strife between the groups, partially based on that. But also, there was also a desire, and this has further antecedents before the deportation, to uh, be moved to areas that were more European and less Asian. So uh, you saw that they preferred to associate, particularly linguistically and culturally, with the Russian population in Kazakhstan rather than the Kazakhs.
Yeah. I am interested in the role of elites in these societies. Were they more receptive to Russian policies as a way to improve their status?
Uh, Not really, because the before the deportation, the Soviets had this policy of indigenization or korenizatsiya, where the elites were created on a basis of nationalnost and basis of ruling their own ethnic territories. So you had these, at least in a symbolic and cultural sense, these union of ethno states. So they had these autonomous territories where the elite were uh, indigenous to some extent, and there was an active Soviet policy to make it more indigenous in terms of its composition, but also indigenous in terms of the use of the titular language and in the government and courts and education and media in each of these territories. So the elites were to be a socialist in content and national in form. So it wasn't so much to become Russians, but to become Soviet socialists of their own national group and therefore be unified with the Russians, uh, not in sense of being uh, culturally similar, but being ideologically similar, being unified by socialism and communist party rule.
Okay, thanks. To what extent did these deportations affect ethnic tension? So, for example, it is often said that colonialism created ethnic divides. I would like to know if the deportation policy of the Russians had a similar impact.
Oh yes, and there were. I mean, for instance, in Kazakhstan, they housed deportees in the same houses, right? The different rooms with the Kazakhs, and often uh, they didn't have any language in common. Resources are limited. In this case, the first one that is being tested is housing, which was in severe shortage. But you see already other conflicts, religious. So there was a demand by the Kazakhs that the German deportees who were not Muslim not be allowed to be buried in local cemeteries. There was a resistance by many of the deportees to working on the collective farms in Kazakhstan.
Yes. Now I'm still reading your document and I'm looking at a topic titled "The Exploitation of Labor,"
I,
and I'm going to read a
I
small
did not
section.
want to.
Hello, hello,
Yeah,
hello, Jonathan,
yes,
Jonathan, hello, Jonathan. I'm
I'm here.
Yeah. You froze up for a bit.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, not a problem. So did you remember what I said about the exploitation of labor?
Go ahead, repeat it.
Yes. The primary factor that prevented the deaths among the special settlers from being even higher was the same one that restrained mortality among the slave population of the New World. The Stalin regime desired to use the deported nationalities as a source of captive labor to develop remote areas of the USSR. Hence, it opted not to directly exterminate them through execution, as the Nazis did the Jews or the Hutu movement did to the Tutsis. It also provided deportees with a minimal amount of food, housing, and medical assistance. So, are you saying that because of economics, the Stalinist regime moderated the effects of deportation?
Yes, the lethality was high, as I mentioned. In some cases, such as the Chechen, 30% of the population died prematurely in 4 years. But it would have been much, much higher if they did not wish to use these peoples as a captive and very, I don't know, very poorly compensated labor force. So if it had been that they had not wanted to use the labor, then they wouldn't have provided them with any assistance whatsoever. So the death rate would have been higher in that case. And so, yeah, in that sense, you can see uh, obviously other cases of forced labor. If you want to use the labor force, if it all dies out, it's worthless. So as brutal and ruthless as it is, you can always imagine a scenario where it would have been worse because they wouldn't even have that basic economic concern.
Okay, another question. Compared to working class people, were the material conditions of the labor similar, or should I say, what was their level of material consumption relative to poor people?
Well, it was quite bad. The special settlers were basically uh, a separate legal class because they didn't have the same rights as far as other Soviet citizens with regard to uh, their ability to move from place to place or choose their place of residence. And this had all kinds of other knock on effects regarding education and employment, uh, etc. So they were legally just above prisoners, actually, in the Gulag camps. Whereas uh, the Soviet population as a whole, they had the right to uh, move around and change their place of residence, particularly for changing of employment for improving their status. So if you look at the material conditions, they're much worse as well. So even while the average Russian or Kazakh farmer in the 1940s, not super rich, they were doing considerably better than the deported Germans or Chechens or other peoples classified as special settlers.
Very, very interesting because some studies, for example, those published by J.R. Ward and others, have argued that relative to working class whites, slaves enjoyed a moderately high level of material consumption. Hence, I asked that question. Now, Jonathan, were
Uh,
groups selected based on skills and education? So, for example, I'm seeing where you said that the Crimean Tartars worked in construction and mining.
no, they weren't. I mean, they were deported on the basis that these nationalities were enemy peoples, that they were inherently opposed to the Soviet government in some way. So, in the case of the Crimean Tatars, they were accused of collaborating with the German occupation during the Second World War. But what happens is once they're deported, you start to have a division of labor. So initially, with the Crimean Tatars, they wanted them all to be on farms agriculturally, but they couldn't survive on the farms, particularly because the uh, provision of private plots of land, which was essential for feeding the population, particularly the rural population that lived on the farm, was very, very slow. So since they didn't have these private plots of land, these kitchen plots to grow food on for their own consumption, it was not. Uh, Many of them were not able to survive on the kolkhozes, the collective farm. So then they moved to where they could get a wage job, be paid a salary, or I guess a wage, hourly wage, to, to buy food on the market. And for the Crimean Tatars, this was part construction and part industrial. So they became more industrialized because those areas of work were generally undesirable to the Uzbeks. The Uzbek standard of living and traditional way of life was much more adjusted to the traditional life on the farm agriculturally. So they didn't want to move to the cities and they didn't want to take the industrial jobs for both cultural reasons, but also in real terms, there have been studies of this. Their access to material goods actually declined because they didn't have all of the uh, goods that they could acquire themselves on a farm.
Okay, great point. What about gender? Were people treated differently based on sex or sexual orientation or religion? Were those issues important?
Yeah, it especially comes up. There's a large mobilization of peoples for forced labor in actual labor camps from the special settlers called the Labor Army, Trudovaya Armia, particularly among the Germans. Initially, it's all men, but then, unique to the Germans, they mobilize a significantly large number of women, and this happens in October of 1942. So, of the 315,000 or so, basically the entire able-bodied adult population of the Germans in the Soviet Union, uh, about a third of them are women. And this creates a crisis because they're almost all the cases their husbands, if they were still alive, had already been mobilized. So we had a huge population of children left without any parents in Kazakhstan and Siberia. So this is, yeah, an issue that the Soviets couldn't overcome basic biology, that the mother is responsible for rearing children.
Okay. And the death rates differ by gender?
Yes, it was much higher for men.
And why? Why?
Well, in the case of the Germans, it's much earlier, starting in already in some cases in September 1941, but really getting underway in January of 42. So there's a
Okay.
longer period of time, and the worst periods of deprivation in the camps during the war. That is early 1942. But there's also more of them, and I for a number of reasons, and this comes up with almost all of the deported groups, including later deportees that were from countries that the majority of the population was not deported from, places like Estonia. Uh, Women seem to just be able to physically survive these types of long-term uh, deprivations better than men, and so women have always had a longer lifespan than men, but it becomes much more acute in these type of crisis situations. And of course, since it was during the war, many of these nationalities had already lost a number of men fighting on the front against Nazi Germany.
Thanks again. And did children work in these camps?
Uh, well, it depends what you mean by children. The
Below
officially
15, below 15, 10-year-olds, 12-year.
no, no. There were some. The 15 was the official cutoff date, and there were some people that were younger, 14, 13, but I haven't come across any 10-year-old. But what did happen was women who were mobilized would often take their own children or younger siblings into the camps with them, where they lived in the barracks, but they didn't work.
And what methods were employed to punish people who resisted?
Uh, they were tried by special panels, and a whole bunch of well, there were a whole bunch of different types of punishment, but for serious resistance, to be tried by a panel, and they could either be sent to a labor camp as a convict for a number of years, or they could be executed. So there are a number of executions, but the big one was if you tried, for instance, to leave your place of settlement, you could receive 20 years of forced labor in a camp. So this would be the 26th of November 1948 decree. Uh, and anybody that was a free citizen and helped you could get 5 years. So it's rather draconian in terms of this is just people moving from one place to another.
Hmm. Were executions frequent?
At that time, not so much. They're in the tens of thousands, but in 37, 38, the Soviet government had executed over 700,000 people, and 250,000 of them had been in national operations where they had targeted some of these same ethnic groups, most notably ethnic Germans, but there was also some other diaspora groups. Polish were the largest group targeted in 37 and 38 as far as the numbers of people incarcerated or shot. So that was the big spike in executions in 37 and 38. And after that, there becomes this more concern, as I said, how can these people be used as a labor force? So if you just take them out and shoot them, rather than have them employed in various sectors of the Soviet economy, there's no gain to be made from that.
Okay. Was there a movement lobbying for reparations after the end of the special settlement regime?
There are movements to restore their national autonomous territories and to allow them to return. And most of these movements are actually successful. The first one is the Chechens, who just start returning after the special settlement restrictions are lifted in 1956. And then in 57 and 58, the Soviet government restores the territories for the Chechens, the Ingush, the Karachais, the Balkars, and the Kalmuks. And for those who hadn't returned yet, to facilitate their return back to their national homeland. So only the Germans, Crimean Tatars, and Meskhetian Turks are left in exile. And there are movements of all three of these groups to try and return to restored homeland, although the Meskhetian Turks, it would be a new one since they didn't have one before. But the Crimean Tatars had a Crimean ASSR, Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, and there was a Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. So both of these groups had movement to return to their homeland, but they weren't successful during the Soviet era. So the Crimean Tatars ended up returning to Crimea really starting in 1987 with the Glasnost and Perestroika is implemented by Gorbachev, and then the Soviet Union collapsed in 91. For the Germans, they kind of like give up on it by about 1968 and decide that the only German homeland that's really available to them is West Germany, and push to emigrate there. And after 1987, we see mass migration from the Soviet Union of ethnic Germans into Germany.
Thanks again. In the beginning of the interview, you referred to Stokely Carmichael.
Yes.
Would you argue that Stokely Carmichael erred in using the term internal colonization to reflect the state of African Americans in the States?
Hmm. Uh, it depends on what time period you're talking about.
In
By the time he was
segregation, so
writing,
for segregation,
oh, so you're talking about before he was writing,
yes, yes.
because that article came out in '69 and segregation ended in '64. Uh, yeah, there's. I mean, there are some parallels, I guess. Certainly, one of the things you see in the colonial world, especially where there's settler populations, is physical segregation. And you see, for instance, the South African Communist Party referred to apartheid as a colonialism of a special type because the Afrikaners were no longer connected to the Netherlands, right? You had the European population was living in South Africa itself. So I think this is kind of where the idea comes from, that instead of being separated by an ocean, you're separated by a smaller geographical territory. But the idea, I guess, was to make the analogy to more traditional forms of colonialism. But even there, it's difficult because colonialism, even when you talk about, say, British colonialism, isn't one thing. Uh, Colonialism in Rhodesia was very, very different than it was in Ghana.
Yes, and what were some of these differences when we're comparing Ghana and Rhodesia?
Well, the big difference that is always stressed is the difference between colonies of extraction and colonies of settlement. So there's almost no European population that's successfully settled in the what was the Gold Coast, becomes Ghana because of yellow fever and malaria. So what you do have is instead a lot of indirect rule, as Lord Lugard would say, through various indigenous chiefs who are contracted out to rule on behalf of the British, as far as kind of creating a merchant class rather than settlers from other places in the world. You see that a lot of them are in Ghana descendants of short term because they die pretty fast. Uh, Single European men who take indigenous wives. So you have this kind of a mixed race elite, but it's not very big. And then most of the rule, particularly once you get away from the coast, is the traditional leadership that existed before colonialism, cutting deals with the colonial power to work for them.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the history of Ghana, in particular the Asante Empire. I've read quite a bit on its merchant class and how they least appropriated British culture.
Uh, I lived in Ghana for almost 6 years, but I never got to Kumasi, which was the capital of the Asante. So I was based in Greater Accra area, though Accra is such a huge city geographically and got 5 million people now, which was the entire population of Ghana when it got independence. That it had become kind of a world in its own. Uh, but I will tell you that a lot of non Asante, particularly those who are not Akan at all, so Akan is a kind of language group spoken by the Asante and related people like the Achim and the Fanti. They don't have a real uh, friendly memories of the Asante. So the Ga and the Ewe, even though they became political allies in the 19th century, the earlier period with the slave trade has made them kind of, in historical memory, enemies.
One historian from Ghana describes the Asante Empire as an imperial power. They also engage in colonialism, so I'm not surprised that tension still exists.
Yeah, well, the Asante were the main power there. They were uh, very rich. They had gold mines, and they had slaves, and they were involved in trading of slaves to the Arabs up north. And then when the Portuguese arrived in Elmina, and the Asante were allied with the people in the city of Elmina against the Fanti, who kind of surrounded them. The people in Elmina allied with the Portuguese and then later the Dutch, uh, who were allied with the Asante. So this gave the Asante a huge boost in that now they had even a second outlet for excess slaves that they didn't need for their own economy. So in addition to the uh, slave trade to the north over the Sahara, they had a much more efficient slave trade by ships to Europe. So, they had an incentive to conquer more land, to take more slaves, to get more guns, to conquer more land, to take more slaves, to get more guns.
And the Asante, they also conquered the Fanti people.
Uh, yeah, eventually. Well, I don't know if they ever did. The Fanti Confederation was basically independent, but at the same time the U.S. Confederacy was. A little later, 1865 to 1869. And in 1875, southern Ghana officially becomes a British colony. Uh, they were fighting against the Fanti.
Yeah, and they won.
Uh,
I know that they were successful in battle against the Fanti.
they might have been successful in battle. The uh,
Yeah. But
there's not though. Today there's not a lot of tension between the Fanti and the Asante, particularly because linguistically they're pretty. Fanti and Chui are similar. They're both Akan speakers.
this conversation, Jonathan, is so intriguing because we often assume that only Europeans built empires and colonized non-white people when empire building is the norm in history. It's not the exception. It's the norm.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you have a situation where one uh, people can organize themselves to provide advantage over the surrounding peoples, they will then try and take advantage to take the resources from surrounding people. And I think that's a lot what you have with the Asante is that they were highly organized, centralized empire. Many of the various ethnic groups in Ghana uh, were not so organized. They have a distinction between people like the Asante and some of the various peoples in the north. They call the various peoples in the north who didn't have centralized state leadership over large areas of territory, acephalous, to be without a head, which is kind of misnomer because they did have organization, but it was on a lower and more diffuse level. But when it comes to military strength, obviously the centralized type of statehood the Asante had was a huge advantage in conquering other peoples and enslaving them and selling them to the Europeans.
Yeah, the Asante were brilliant warriors and tacticians. They even defeated the British in battle.
A couple of times, yeah. It took
Yeah,
a very long time for the British to finally conquer Kumasi. So that's why the British were first based in part. I mean, obviously they wanted the coast for trade, but the first capital was at Cape Coast, and then they moved it to Accra, and then bought the Danish out in Osu, which is part of Accra. But yes, they had a. It wasn't until uh, you know just a few years before World War I that the final northern part of Ghana, north of Kumasi, was conquered by the British and incorporated into the Gold Coast colony.
Asante. I really like talking about the Asante, but now we have to move on and discuss your second article. Yeah, the Asante people are very, very fascinating, but we have to discuss your second article.
All right.
Socialist racism, ethnic cleansing, and racial exclusion in the USSR and Israel. And I will start by reading the first sentence. Historical comparisons of ethnic cleansing are still quite rare and have only touched on a handful of cases. Why is this so?
Part of it is that to do comparative history, uh, and you'll note that I actually don't do a lot of comparative history. Just I just have a few pieces out there. You have to really be an expert on more than one specialization, and this course takes study in the history, geography, and languages of it. So there's this technical problem, and sometimes it's great. I had a conference in Ghana on forced labor, and I was going to do a comparative paper on forced labor in the Soviet Union and Portuguese colonial Africa. And as I started on, I found out there was no way I was going to ever learn enough in time on Portuguese colonial Africa to be able to do justice to a comparative approach for that paper. So there's a technical problem, but there's also an ideological problem. People get kind of stuck in these idea that the area they're studying is absolutely unique, that there isn't really anything that's comparable. So there's no point in trying to make it a comparative argument because you're just going to come up with differences.
All right. Another question. Should we ever compare the USSR and Nazi Germany? Is that morally appropriate?
Uh, I think it's fine. There are cases where it's done well. I use Robert Gelatli's book, uh, Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler in the Age of Social Catastrophe, both in Ghana and Kurdistan, and it is basically a comparative history of Germany and the Soviet Union between World War One, all the way up to the end of World War Two. And it works well because one of his main arguments is that what happens in Germany between 1918 and 1933, this period of time between World War One and Hitler being appointed chancellor, is in many ways a reaction to what happens in the Soviet Union. That is the argument that has been made by people going back to Ernst Nolte. National Socialism is a reactionary movement, and it is one of the things it is reacting against is Bolshevism. So if you didn't have a Bolshevik revolution, fascism in Italy and National Socialism in Germany would have looked much different because they wouldn't have organized themselves in opposition to that ideology.
And what are the differences between fascism and Nazism? Because you mentioned that brilliant expert, Ernest.
Yeah, well, you've talked to Paul Godfrey. That's his
Yeah,
specialty.
I know Paul is a genius, but people often
I
should.
would say there are a number of differences. One of the crucial differences is the role of anti-Semitism, which is a kind of foundational pillar in German National Socialism, as one of the things that they're opposing is international Jewry, and this requires effort to root them out, starting in Nuremberg laws in 1936. Whereas in fascist Italy, from the beginning until they were kind of forced by their German ally to remove them, there are Jews in the fascist movement, including very high-ranking uh, positions in the fascist movement. So they don't have this uh, anti-Semitism as a core of the system in fascist Italy, and insofar as it comes about later on, it's because of pressure from Berlin.
Yes, and before we started the interview, I noted that your piece is really comparing Stalin to some of its Zionist supporters, and I argue that Stalin played a crucial role in drumming up support for the state of Israel. Why was that done?
It was largely done. The Soviets' policy is not. Uh, it shifts. It oscillates in a period of time. But in the late 40s, the Soviet Union saw the opportunity to support the Zionists in Palestine, particularly in 48, when they have the war against the Arabs for the first time, and then it lasted into 49 or so, to mainly weaken the British Empire. So Palestine became a British mandate after World War One with the League of Nations, as did Jordan and Iraq. And the Soviets saw the British trying to put pro-British monarchs, the Hashemites, on the thrones of their various former mandates, particularly Jordan with King Abdullah the First, and also in Iraq with King Faisal. Uh, and so it looked to see that the Arab governments in Britain were very Arab governments in the Middle East were very pro-British, and the British Empire being kind of a bastion of imperialism and capitalism, and not only that, but also a long-term geopolitical opponent of the Russian Empire, particularly the border between India and Central Asia and Afghanistan. So this is a way of weakening the British Empire. The idea that the Zionists would be pro-Soviet and allied with the USSR, and that, of course, breaks down spectacularly in the 1950s. But certainly, even from kind of just a pure Machiavellian point of view, enemy, my enemy is my friend. And this was seen as a way to greatly weaken the British uh, hold in the Middle East, uh, which was centered on their Arab former mandates, such as Iraq and Jordan, which did come into conflict with the state of Israel.
Good. You also contend that ethnic cleansing in Israel was influenced by the Soviet. To what extent is this true and supported by evidence? I think this is going to be a bit controversial to some of our
Well,
listeners.
I mean, I have the quotations from a number of Zionist and Israeli leaders that they saw uh, some of the deportations, particularly the Volga Germans and Crimean Tatars, as models for how they could remove the Palestinian Arabs from the territory, which was largely done during the First War. So in 1948, you have either expulsion or flight and into neighboring territories of Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Most of the Arabic speaking Christian and Muslim population. So in 1947, the population of the Palestinian Mandate has become about 50% Jewish due to recent immigration from Europe. And after the armistice in 1949, the population of what is under Israeli control, so it doesn't include the West Bank or Gaza, uh, or the Golan Heights yet, is about 90% Jewish. So there's a reduction of the Arab population by a significant margin.
And what are some of the similarities between both programs? Soviet.
Well, there is in some cases forced removal. People are marched across the border into Jordan. There is the use of violence, obviously, in this, although in the case of the Soviet Union, the violence is usually in terms of killing people just to get rid of groups that were too troublesome to move, particularly in Chechnya and Crimea. In the state of Israel, it's more strategic. It's to provide for an incentive, as it were, fear to make the Arab population leave and flee to safety. So this is particularly noted in the most famous massacre at Deir Yassin on April 9th in 1948. So they have kind of a different motive there. But and finally, the status that the Palestinian Arabs that were not expelled, the 10% that remained in Israel from 1948 to 1966, they were under military command, and it had a lot of similarities with the special settlement system set up by the Soviets in terms of being under surveillance, having to register with the authorities, and having restrictions on their civil rights.
And tell us about some of the differences.
Well, obviously, the size is a lot different. So, in the case of the Soviet Union, you're deporting people very large over a large geographical territory. You are moving people, in some cases, thousands of kilometers. Uh, in the case of Israel, you're moving people to uh, very short distances, in some cases, over across the border into Lebanon or Jordan. Particularly since Jordan took over the West Bank from the Mandate of Palestine. So King Abdullah the First ruled over uh, what is now the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, uh, after the First War with the Israelis. They could move people, from the coastal region into the West Bank uh, fairly easily because there's not a large distance to cover. Second, because of this, you don't have nearly as many fatalities among the Palestinian Arabs. Uh, they're not being dumped out in the middle of nowhere with no access to any material goods. So you do have organization, particularly United Nations relief works, to provide for sustenance, although not on a super high level, but enough that we don't have a massive increase in premature deaths the way you do in the Soviet Union, where something like 20% of the population perishes.
All right. But before we continue our discussion, I must ask this question. It's a bit of a diversion. Is the Holocaust unique? Because in your piece, you speak about it briefly. So I would like
Uh,
your opinion on the issue of the Holocaust.
yeah, I don't think it's unique in the sense that it can't be compared. I think it's unusual in that for a variety of reasons, but one of which is geography, which we were just discussing. There is this attempt by the National Socialists to uh, basically, in certain areas occupied, particularly in the east, to exterminate as many Jews as possible. So, whereas, as I said in the Soviet case, right, they're not particularly concerned that a large minority are dying off, but they do provide some minimal material goods that make sure that they're not totally deprived of a labor force, where that is not a consideration for the Jewish population under the Nazis, since they have other groups they can use for forced labor. Ukrainians, Poles are the two largest.
Group. All right. I just wanted a response. I think that's a very crucial point. Question: how did the Soviet Union provide support to the Zionists? So, for example, did the Soviet offer military technology, diplomatic assistance, etc.?
Yeah, well, they supported them in the UN, and they brought with them, of course, the new governments that they had installed in East Central Europe. Poland was active. Czechoslovakia, even before the communists took power in '48, was active, but they continued the policy. So they provided them with that. They provided them with armaments, particularly heavy artillery, which the Palestinian Arabs did not have. They provided them with some training, but probably the most important thing is they allowed a number to leave, particularly Poland, but also Czechoslovakia as well, to go and fight in the war against the Arabs. So it's quite substantial, and particularly heavy artillery and weapons were crucial since there was a arms embargo on the region to try and contain the fighting. So the Soviet bloc basically just ignored it and armed the Zionists, which had three main factions, but the biggest is the Haganah, and so they become kind of the a core of the Israeli Defense Force after the war.
All right. I would love to share this paragraph with our audience. During 1948 and 1949, the Soviet bloc treated Israel almost as if it was one of its members. Soviet bloc arms and support secured Israel's founding and the dispossession of the Palestinians. Israel initially expressed thanks for this support in the most glowingly obsequious Stalinist language. The fulsome praise of Stalin from the Israeli leadership rivaled that of the most supplicant communist parties. On 4th November 1948, David Ben-Gurion sent the following telegram to Joseph Stalin. In the name of the State of Israel and in my own name, I am pleased to offer best wishes on the occasion of the anniversary of the October Revolution, which guaranteed national equality to the peoples of the USSR, secured employment, and a means of existence for all its workers. Full stop. I'm just sharing this to indicate that during the early years, the Soviets and Zionists had a close relationship because some of our listeners may not read the entire essay, but in the event that they would like evidence, this is a good piece of evidence.
Yeah,
No,
certainly the relationship was very close in 48 and 49, and it really probably doesn't become severed until 1954. But even then, you're still 48 to 54 is only 6 years. So it's one of these things where the Soviets had great enthusiasm that they were going to get a ally, at the very least, maybe a dependent client state in the Middle East on the Levant. And by the time the the revolution in Egypt under Nasser, uh, they reconsider because the things fall apart. The Israelis uh, do take a number of actions which are not very pleasing to the Soviets. The biggest one, which is to uh, encourage Jewish emigration out of the Soviet Union, particularly of highly educated and skilled Jews, which the Soviets, for economic reasons, want to keep in the USSR.
Well, I was planning to ask you that question later in the interview, but you answered it. I wanted to know what led to the breakdown between both breakdown in the relationship between both parties, and you just answered the question. Now I'm going to talk about economics. Did the Soviets and Zionists converge on economic issues? Did they have affinity for socialist rhetoric?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the Israeli economy up until 1977 election, when Likud wins for the first time ever. And they win by appealing actually to the Mizrahi, the Jews from the Arab countries vote, as opposed to the Ashkenazi European Jews. It's heavily socialistic. You have the cooperative movement, the kibbutz. You have a very strong labor union movement connected with the state. You have a lot of nationalized industry. Uh, in many ways, Israel has an economy that is somewhere between that of Scandinavia and the Warsaw Pact during the period of time between the late 1940s and late 1970s. And then after 77, there's a lot of liberalization of the Israeli economy and becomes much more privatized. But during the era when there is basically a one party state under the Labor Party, it's very socialistic economically.
Mm, Thanks. My next question is related to this sentence on page 64 uh, of your article. Both the Soviet and Israeli states also espouse a socialist rhetoric dedicated to equality while practicing forms of racial discrimination similar to apartheid in South Africa. Should we compare both systems?
Oh, we can compare any system. I
Yeah.
said the problem is, of course, that lots of people don't have the background to do comparisons. Uh, and certainly, when you start talking about learning multiple languages uh, and getting into in-depth history, it becomes more difficult. I don't see a moral problem. What I do see sometimes as a problem is you get we have two fruit trees. One is apples and one is oranges, and we can't really get more beyond that. I sometimes I see that being as a problem. That there are basic structural similarities in some comparison, but when you get down to the details, they because of historical reasons they're very different. But I do see, we have groups that are legally defined as having uh, a lesser or indifferent set of rights than the dominant group in the case of the Soviet Union and Israel and South Africa during this period of time in the late 40s and early 50s.
I agree with you, Jonathan. I agree with you 100%. But why do people experience blowback when they compare policies in Israel to apartheid? That's my issue. Why is it such a politically contentious matter?
Oh, well, because if you are pro-Israeli and you think South Africa is bad, you don't want to associate the bad South African policies with the state of Israel. Right? So I would say that is the main reason. Uh, I don't think it's because there aren't some basic similarities. Now, it is possible, I think, and I've seen it done. You could make the argument again that the similarities are more superficial uh, than they appear. But that's not a moral argument, but rather a technical argument. But I think people have this kind of visceral moral rejection of the comparison because they look at, well, South Africa is an undiluted evil during the apartheid regime, which is an oversimplification, and the state of Israel is an undiluted good, which is another simple oversimplification, rather than try and get into uh, the actual history of what was happening in these places.
Okay. And Jonathan, again, this is a political question. Would you describe the action of the Zionists as constituting war crimes?
Uh, yes, if you're going to define war crimes as actions that are prohibited by various international treaties, such as the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention, they certainly do qualify. Uh,
Okay, well, I won't share my opinion at this moment, but personally, if the evidence suggests that they committed crimes against humanity and it's strong, then one should be allowed to make such a view without backlash or blowback. No,
well, uh, I'm not sure if you've ever worked in academia, but there's no such
no,
thing
I've
as without blowback. There never is.
no, I've never worked in academia before. I'm a researcher, business analyst, writer, and no, I interview interesting people like yourself. But
Well,
I'm all for
academia
free speech.
academia varies, but it can, the situation in the U.S. is not one that is conducive to I want to say
To learning or to
freedom of inquiry.
intellectual
Ironically,
innovation.
it's a lot better in some other countries. So it wasn't too bad in Ghana. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it certainly uh, I never felt there was uh, any completely taboo subjects. Nothing that was completely prohibited, but there certainly was stuff you bring up. There would be a pushback and argument by of colleagues.
Cancel culture is reflected by wealthy countries. It's not a problem in poor countries, at least for now. But cancel culture is a rich country problem. So, for
Uh,
example, I'm a Jamaican, and up to a few years ago, political correctness was not an issue, but it is becoming an issue because of exposure to Western philosophy and Western celebrities. But for the most part, people in Jamaica can speak freely. But
me,
Jonathan,
me.
You can
Yeah.
continue. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I want to say we had a Jamaican in our department. Was doing a PhD on the soldiers brought over from Jamaica by the British to fight against the Asante.
Interesting. A
Uh,
Jamaican man, a man or a woman.
it was a Jamaican man.
Okay, which university?
Uh, well, he was getting his PhD at the University of Ghana in
Okay,
Legon,
okay.
but he was doing it on Jamaican soldiers bought by the British because they figured that the Jamaicans, being black, would have a natural resistance to malaria, which is not the case. This is not how biology works, but
No.
this was what the British believed. And the Jamaicans said they would do it, but they wouldn't do it unless they were categorized as Europeans for purposes of pay and not categorized as Africans. So you have the under European soldiers, they'll have British and Jamaican because this is how the payroll was organized, and they're separate from the African soldiers that were mobilized to fight against the Asante.
Interesting story. I'm sure our audience will appreciate it. No, Jonathan, there's another politically contentious issue that we are going to talk about.
Okay.
Hitler versus Stalin. We can criticize Stalin, we can question his intentions and motives, we can question the death toll, but we cannot question Hitler's intentions and motives if we're not consistent with mainstream orthodoxy.
Uh,
Yeah. This is I really would like to hear your opinion because Robert Conquest wrote several brilliant books, and his books have been criticized, but we cannot doubt statistics provided to us by the German government.
so, yeah, I'm not an expert on the National Socialist regime. As I say, the books that I used to teach it, the Gelatli, who was actually a historian of Germany and particularly the Holocaust, and I thought he was pretty balanced in his work. And Timothy Schneider's Bloodlands, which is a narrower work, but also comparative. Uh, but yeah, there are certainly a lot more sensitivities and controls on that sphere of history than in most. I mean, so uh,
Yes, you have to be very cautious when you're speaking about Hitler. If you don't,
uh,
you're going to be demonetized.
yeah,
So,
I,
so I believe that you're a smart man, but this video is being taped and I'm going to put it up on YouTube, so you have to be extra careful, like
I,
myself, like
I,
like myself.
I don't delve into it that much. One, because it's not my area, but two, because a lot of it is rather irrelevant detail when it comes to the rest of the world. So I mean, it doesn't matter what you say about that. It doesn't really affect what I'm saying over here, right? It's not a something I have to uh, be overly concerned with, right? If the consensus is A, it doesn't change what I do over here, for instance, on Soviet minorities. Consensus is B on Germany, doesn't really change. So uh, I don't deal with it too much. For one reason, you say it's a more controlled and more sensitive area of history, and I prefer to not get into drama and uh, controversy that doesn't really lead anywhere, right? There's lots of heat and very little light.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. If we were not living in such a politically controlled environment, I would be more than happy to recommend a particular book, but I won't. I will email you the book, but
uh,
it's an interesting book on the Holocaust. But
okay.
Jonathan, we're about to wrap up. However, I would
Uh,
love for you to tell us a little about your latest work. You wrote a book on repression in the Soviet Union.
yeah.
Yeah, I would like to hear a little about
I
it.
I, I have a finished a book manuscript on the ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union, particularly the war years 41, all the way up to 55. But really, as far as the emphasis, although the book actually goes all the way up to uh, almost modern time, but it will be published by an academic publisher out of Europe. I'm waiting for the contract
Okay.
now, which they said they will send me as soon as they draft it. And I don't know how long it will take to get out. The last book I had published was like 10 years ago, so I'm hoping maybe the technology
Yeah,
is
and
lets
that's
them speed
that's the
it
book.
up.
That's the book about the Soviet, right? Soviet repression.
I've published. I've had well, I have had four. This will be my fourth book, but no, the third book I had was also on Russian
Yep.
Germans.
Yeah, penal. Yeah, I'm asking about your book
Oh,
on
the penal
penal
system
policies.
that not,
Yes, in the Soviet
that
Union.
was that was published in '97. That's quite old.
Yeah, yeah, but I'm yet to read, and I'm sure most of our viewers are unfamiliar with it. So if you wish, just give us a synopsis.
The Stalinist penal system is
Yeah,
it's basically just the history of the development of Soviet labor camps and internal exile during the 1930s and 40s. It's got a lot of tables and statistics. So that was published in 1997, and it was the first book I wrote. So that one, it's still around, I guess. I think my second book, Ethnic Cleansing the USSR, 1937 to 1949, which came out in 1999, is probably a lot more well known if you just go by the number of times it's cited compared to the first book.
yeah. I've been looking at your articles and essays on Google Scholar, but Jonathan, are you still working as a professional academic?
Well, it depends what you mean by working.
So for example, are you employed by a university?
I am currently not. My last contract expired and it was not renewed. It is currently being adjudicated in the courts of the Kurdish region of Iraq, uh, and has been there since 2019 when I left. Uh, but no, the job market for academics is really, really bad.
The
I
job market, Jonathan, the job market for academics is if it's bad if you're not talking about racism.
I do talk about
No, no,
racism.
but you should be you should be noting that white people are racist and only white people can be racist.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
um,
you are debunking the
I talk
notion.
about certain white people being racist against other white people.
That's not
Um,
sexy. That's not sexy
all right. Um, yeah,
because you
I don't. Yeah, but even then, it's the number of jobs even to apply to has gotten really bad in the last since this COVID shutdown. So I applied to 125 jobs recently, and I got three interviews, or three places interviewed me. One place interviewed me more than once, and I didn't get the job at the end. I'm not sure if that's a blessing or not because it was in the middle of Minneapolis.
but Jonathan, I'm familiar with your work, so I will be posting them on my Twitter page. Though so far my followership is pretty small, but I will post your pieces and share your ideas with my colleagues. Jonathan, it was a pleasure to have you. I really enjoyed our discussion, and I expect you to come back at some point.
Right, and I'll see you on my show Saturday night.
Yes, all right.
All right, I'll see you later. Thank you very much.
Yes.